All right, welcome back to the program. I have my guest here with me. Just like I said earlier at the beginning of the program, I have Professor Chuka Osisioma, the president of ANAN. ANAN is the Association of National Accountants of Nigeria. He's the Chairman Governing Council. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now let's get started. Speak to me about your impression when you saw the GDP numbers and what you and your colleagues think.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, when I heard that in the last quarter, the GDP grew at an unprecedented rate, my first reaction is, when will this catch up with the reality in my pocket? I just said I wouldn't have associated this rapid rise with the current realities on the ground. But then, that's how economic science is. Someone says there are ways of lying, and that part of it is statistics and figures that at times they don't quite match up. But it's a good news indeed. And elsewhere, such news will be celebrated, that from negative growth rates, we've now entered the positive range and attained something that is a wee bit phenomenal. In fact, I don't think we've had any such rise since 2014. So very exciting news. And then I would want to, if you want to know my first reaction, I say, I hope government will not relax and say, wonderful, we are doing it all well. The best thing would be to analyze the components of this growth and see whether the economy is moving in the direction we want it to move, and see what we can do to sustain this increase so that it will not be cosmetic at all. The reality will be evident for all to see. So let me leave it at that. That's what I would consider my first reaction. Okay,
let me interrogate your reaction then, because you did say when you saw it, you were surprised. So how are you able to link it to your pocket?
Yes.
In fact, perhaps you mirror what many Nigerians will say, that, oh, they say GDP, they grow. What's in the happen? I can't. Food is more expensive.
Exactly.
I'm not making more money. Even if I'm making more money, it is going into my daily expenses. So I want to interrogate that further. Why? Because sometimes too, people tend to confuse what GDP is and how it affects your pockets.
Well, let me come this way. I don't know, perhaps let me start with a cycle. Businesses have cycles. The highs and the lows, the zenith and the nadir, the growth and the, declensions. They're all part of the economy. And these things are cyclical. And there are usually 4 different cycles. That's when an economy begins to contract. When it contracts, it has an effect on the GDP. From a rapid growth rate, it will begin to shrink. And at times, it could even go into the negative region. Then there is the trough. The second stage is the trough, when the economy hits rock bottom. It comes to its lowest. From a negative growth rate, you know that you just feel that it can go no further down. Then the expansion phase, when things begin to grow and the expectations begin to rise, and we begin to rejoice that things are turning up. And then there's the peak. And the funny thing about the peak is that the peak is the next one before the contraction again. Because these cyclical events, they keep going up and coming. And if we celebrate too much a phase, we will not be prepared for the next phase that is sure to come. These things have played out over centuries. And economists and analysts have seen these things rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall. And nobody can say, well, it's rising, it can never fall again. It will fall. So what to do is, what have we done to make it go this direction? And how do we sustain it? And then the other aspect is to look at the components of the GDP. There are 4 main components. There's the personal, private consumption. Is a vital part of the GDP. Then there is the business investment. How much are we investing in order to sustain the growth potentials of the economy? Then there's the aspect of government spending. And then the last part is the net exports. So when you talk about the growth of the GDP, there are 2 critical elements that we want to watch. Are they growing? investments, are they growing? Net exports, are they growing? Or are we still just, if you watch for decades, forever, Nigeria had been a country where you just mine oil, in its crude form, you export it to people who will receive it, refine, and send back to us at higher costs. So it was as if we were playing a funny game. We use our, the Bible would say, don't throw your jewels at pigs. They will trample upon it and turn upon you. We collect the best we have, sent to them. They do what they want to do with it. We produce cocoa, we send to them. They produce chocolates, we go after that. We produce crude and send to them. They refine it, we go after those things. No plans to produce those things after how many years? More than 70 years of being an oil producing country. Or well, let's say 60 years. Still no attempt to produce those things here. So these are the things. And if that is all that our export involves, you discover that it creates a problem. Look even at the entire GDP. What's the proportion of manufacturing? For any country that is developing well, the industrial aspect of manufacturing will be a key element in the GDP. Okay. So when you look at these things, you see that we may be excited at the growth, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Okay, at this point, let me bring in Johnson Chukwu, who is the Chief Group Managing Director of Cowry Asset Management. Mr. Chukwu, good to see you. Welcome to the program. Can you hear me?
Thank you for having me.
Yes, welcome.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the program. You're being joined here by Professor Chuka Osisioma, who is the president of ANAN. And let me get your view about the GDP. I haven't spoken to you since these numbers came out. Interpret your own sentiments towards the Q2 GDP. And also bring in the fact that we have a 5.01% growth in the second quarter of 2021, but where there's seemingly I don't want to say confusion, or people don't really understand, is the base effect. So I want you to come from that standpoint.
Okay, my take on the GDP is that the fact that the GDP expanded by 5.01% is some form of relief. So it's no longer all doom, because in as much as the expansion we saw was largely influenced by what we call the base effect, it was still a growth, unlike a reasonable growth, unlike what we've seen in the recent past, where in the first quarter of this year, the GDP expanded by only 0.51%, and the last quarter of last year, it expanded by only 0.11%. But back to the issue of base effect. If you recall, the Nigerian GDP contracted in the second quarter of last year by about 6.3%. And what that meant is that we saw a dip in the size of the GDP. Let's assume the GDP was 300 and let's assume the GDP was about 400 billion. And then the GDP contracted about $3.5 billion. And then you saw an expansion, a restoration of growth, recovery. So that recovery was maybe from that 375 to now 385. So you will actually say that the GDP has expanded from 375 to 385 billion. I'm just using this hypothetical figure, $385 billion. But that's a reasonable improvement when you compare it to the fact that in previous quarter, it only grew from 372 to 375. So you saw a sharp growth. But remember what has happened is that the GDP had actually contracted, dipped in the second quarter of last year. So you are measuring what it was at the end of June last year to what it was at the end of June this year. And why people are confused about that, because they're saying, look, if the GDP expanded by 5.01%, I can't feel the impact. But they forgot the fact that the second quarter of last year was a complete lockdown. And because there was a complete lockdown, there was near zero economic activity. What you saw that the overall size of the Nigerian economy contracted, went into a trough. And now that we're coming out of that trough, we have not climbed out fully from where we were before the COVID-19 economic crisis. So, but you have seen some level of recovery. It's only when you get to the point where you were before the economy contracted, and then you begin to grow beyond that people will begin to feel the impact. But the basic thing about the base effect that you are measuring from one position to another position. So if the position you're measuring from is a depression, any growth any increase, even if you had not attained the level where it was before that depression, will be measured based on where you were measuring from. And that's what people refer as what we refer as a base effect when we talk in economic terms.
So if I can deduce from what you said, it was because we were all on a lockdown in 2020. So economic activities resumed somewhat this year. So definitely that jump, because everybody has gone back to work and everybody's trying to pick the pieces of their lives or businesses from where we left it last year. So we saw that jump. And if you take a look at the sectors that perhaps contributed to this growth we're seeing, transport, trade, telecoms, and all of that, what do you have to say concerning that?
Okay, I think the transport case and the trade are classical example of how to prove or how further to explain the base effect. If you look at the transport sector, it grew by about 76%. And remember, by this June last year, there was a total or near total lockdown of transportation activities. Apart from few haulage vehicles that were moving goods from the north to the south, personnel vehicles were not moving. Commercial airlines were not moving. Even private airlines were moving very sparingly on emergency cases. There was no air transportation between Nigeria and any other country. Even local flights were all grounded. People were not even moving from one part of the town to the other. So you saw a situation where the transport sector was in a near total lockdown in the second quarter of last year. Now, compare it to what we had at the end of June this year, where commercial flights have resumed, private jets are flying, people are haulage vehicles are moving around, people are moving in their personal vehicles. So when you measure the level of economic activity in terms of transportation, I mean, transport activities now in the second quarter of this year to what it was in the second quarter of last year, you can understand why there was a near 100% growth in transport sector, 76% growth in our transport sector. That explains that. Now take it to the issue of trade. Trade has been in recession for almost 3 years, and you saw a growth about 22% in the trade sector. Simple reason that second quarter of last year, you couldn't do any commercial trading activities. Trade was largely limited to essential medical goods, pharmaceutical products, and what have you. Normal trade activities was almost shut down. So when you measure the minimal level of trade activities that happened in the second quarter of last year to what it is today, where the economy has been nearly reopened, you can understand why you saw a 22% growth in the trade sector. So this growth we saw in the two sectors were largely driven by base effects. Now, on the telecommunication sector, that's an area that should be of concern to the government. And I was actually thinking that the government will also recognize that, look, it may have made some errors in that sector. We've seen a sector that has, in the second last year, grew by more than 14%. Second quarter of this year, grew by only 5.5%. We've seen a consistent decline in the growth of that sector that accounts for about 17, almost 18% of the GDP. Simple reason is this: we've seen policies that government has enunciated in the past couple of quarters or past couple of months that are actually acting as inhibitors to the growth of that sector. And that sector today accounts for it's actually the second largest contributor to the GDP, because it's now bigger than the trade sector. Just immediately after the agriculture sector is the next biggest contributor to the GDP. But we've seen a consistent decline in that sector, driven largely by government policies. We saw a situation where the government said you can no longer, the telecommunication sector can no longer issue new SIM cards. You can't even recover your SIM card if it was lost. And we've seen several forms of registration and validation of your telephone lines. Beyond that, we also know that these companies are facing difficulty in the Northeast and sometimes in the Northwest. So the government policies is actually constraining that sector, and we're beginning to see that in the GDP, declining GDP growth rates of that sector. So that should be of concern to the government. Are we taking the right policies when it comes to the telecommunications? That should be today one of the growth sectors of the economy.
Okay, let me come over to Prof, and you take it from there. What Mr. Chukwu has said in terms of, are we paying enough attention to the sectors that we should pay attention to so that growth, because he said something earlier, that if we take it, we should do a proper analysis of what happened in the second quarter and take a look at it sector by sector. Where have we gone wrong? What can we do, to boost those sectors? So I would like to take you up from there in terms of what specific policies would you like the government, to come up with, or what inhibitions would you want the government to take away to make those specific sectors work than they are working right now?
Thank you very much. I will associate myself very much with the analysis of Mr. Chukwu. I agree completely with him that apart from the drop in activities in the past 1 year, there was this pent-up demand that had been kept in check because of the realities of the times, now released with the end of the lockdown period. And you can see an acceleration of activities, particularly in the area of trade, and that may explain why we are going up. There is no doubt about it that when we look at the overall components of the GDP, there are areas that government can never go wrong. Like has just been said, for a while, telecommunications became the wonder boy of the Nigerian economy. That was the sector that threw the Nigerian economy even way beyond some of the things that helped. If you think of some of the areas, we've talked about recreation and some of these, call it Nollywood and all those things, they've had some impact on the economy. And these are some of the realities that have given us an edge over well-established economies on the African continent, like South African economy. Telecommunications, we were way out. If you look at the population of Nigeria, if you look at the potentials of that market, it's something that government should court, encourage, not put in place policies that will inhibit their performance. There's this other emphasis that government has always been making, medium and small scale enterprises. That can also be a winning point. Great economies have started that way. When you talk about the Asian tigers, that's where their strength lies. We can begin to, apart from paying just lip service to these areas, truly develop them. How do we develop them? Make it easy for them to do business, make easy for them to register their business, remove some of the multiple taxations that make it difficult for them to do business, adjust the interest rate to make it easy for people doing business to obtain credit in order to run business. I keep finding it difficult to understand how developed countries that don't need some of this little money, they will bring down the interest rate to near zero. And then developing countries like ours, where you need every naira of expenditure in order to, step out, interest rate has risen to a point that businessmen cannot lay hold on these sources in order to run their business. How do you get on? I don't want to talk about the other aspect of population, our labor, and the skill or lack of skill of it. I think it was one of these writers who said that our schools teach our young people about a world that has ceased to exist, giving them lessons that they will never ever use. And when I read that, and I'm a teacher, I became really disturbed. I said, then what am I doing in school? In other words, concentrating attention on how to reskill and retool and re-equip the young people in order to enable them come to grips with the challenge of the times, so that they will be quite skilled and they will not be square pegs in round holes. So there are areas we can zoom in. Now let me touch again our electricity. I don't know how people across the country have seen it, but from my own end, I thought electricity had improved greatly in the past few months. At least some of the helps I had bought to help the public power supply, they are lying idle in my house, largely.
Do you mean generators or inverters?
Yes, the generators are lying idle in my house. And for a long while now, I use the public supply, which is not usual. And these are areas you concentrate attention, and you help those small-scale businesses to get things done. Okay. Nigerians are not begging for a free meal. All they're asking for is a conducive atmosphere for them to go on and produce and earn a living. And when they do it, the GDP will take care of itself. We don't need to do any politics of GDP. We don't need to reduce it to a matter of politics or governance or adjustment or manipulation. It will take care of itself.
I like the fact that you said that we don't need any manipulation, because GDP tells the story of what every one of us is doing, what our output is. Mr. Chukwu, let me bring us now to the fact, Prof talked about agriculture earlier on. He also mentioned power, that he has an appreciable number of supply or appreciable amount of supply.
Some improvements.
Right, now, where he stays. I don't know for your area what the power supply is. And let me also bring it to the shake-up, the surprising announcement yesterday. A lot of people were surprised. President Buhari took me by surprise too, by sacking two ministers, two critical ministers to the economy, Minister of Agriculture and Minister of Power. And if we take a look at even the GDP component there, you know, agriculture definitely quite sizable in the GDP basket. What do you think about President Buhari's cabinet reshuffle? What do you think?
Okay, before I go to what I think about Buhari's cabinet, let me respond to your question on the power supply in my area. I live in Lekki Phase 1, and the opposite is the case. Maybe you know Prof. Osisioma, his name in Igbo land means a good tree.
Good tree, yes.
It simply means he's planted in the Goshen where there is power supply. But where I live,
his name is working for him.
The light situation in my home place has been very horrible. And also record there have been multiple system collapses in the past couple of weeks. So, like I said, he is a fortunate person. His name also obviously epitomizes where he's living. But back to the issue of the sacking of the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Power. I think I heard one of the analysts, one of the hosts of the morning programs today, and said, look, it's coming too late and too little. And I think I tend to support that. You see, the reality is that when the president is talking of non-performance of his ministers, many of his ministers are not even in existence. We don't feel them. If you want to single out agriculture, for instance, you've seen consistent decline in agricultural GDP growth. We saw a 3.4% growth in the fourth quarter of last year. It dropped to 2.28% in the first quarter of this year, and now 1.3% in the second quarter of this year, despite the interventions, not from the fiscal authorities, from the monetary authority. We know the central bank has been doing a yeoman job to support the agricultural sector. You have multiple facilities, intervention fund that the central bank has come up with for the agricultural sector, but still yet we are seeing consistent decline in agricultural productivity. Part of it, we must recognize, may go beyond the Minister of Agriculture and will be at the full step of the president, which he has to take on responsibility for that. The issue of increasing level of insecurity is beyond what the minister would do. It is the president who is the commander-in-chief that will have to address the issue of insecurity. If you are killing people, if people are being killed in Jos, if people are being killed in Plateau State, entire Plateau State, Benue State, Zamfara State, Katsina State, Sokoto State, Zamfara State, Borno State, Adamawa State, these are major farming belts. So certainly you're going to see the impact on agriculture. And then unfortunately that level of insecurity is actually pushing southwards. So we must recognize the fact that some of them go beyond what the minister can do. Then on the issue, on the power sector, or the Minister of Power, I had mentioned earlier that I have seen a way, and I know there have been several system collapses of the national grid. We've not been able to increase the amount of power we can produce and wheel out to up to 4,000 megawatts. Since the government came and promised us 10,000 megawatts, we're still struggling with wheeling out 4,000 megawatts. That's, in fact, if you look at the size of the quantum of power produced and distributed in the country, we've not been able to move the needle since this government came into power. And remember, this government made mouths at how simple it is to address the power supply issue. But the most embarrassing aspect of it that we're seeing system collapse around the country, where the entire country is shut down, it is put into total blackout. It doesn't happen in any civilized environment today. So clearly, the Minister of Power has some blame to take for that. And unlike the Minister of Agriculture, who can give excuse that, look, the country is being racked by insecurity, I don't think the Minister of Power has the luxury of such excuse. But beyond that, there are several other ministers that the president should review their performance. I don't know if they do the kind of review within the private sector where people are reviewed. Performance is reviewed every quarter, every half year. I did mention in when we were speaking, I was speaking earlier on the issue of the telecommunications sector, the ICT sector, that we've seen a consistent decline in GDP growth rate. And those declines are largely affected by government ministers' pronouncements, where the minister made a pronouncement that the telco companies can no longer register SIM cards for more than 6 months. Would they ask us to do BVN? We've done this, we've done that, we've done all forms of validation of our person, of the individual holding the number, and then you froze registration of SIM cards. And how do you explain that in a civilized environment? People came home for Christmas, they couldn't buy SIM card. They couldn't buy SIM card.
Okay, Mr.
And you
Chukwu,
say it's for security reasons. You have gotten us to register several means of identification. And the minister should be taking a boot, because that is beginning to affect the GDP growth. I mentioned as the second largest contributor to the GDP. So there are other ministers that the president should ask questions on.
Okay, we'll come to that.
Your report card showing?
Yes, we'll come to the issue of the report card. Prof, what is your own view on concerning this? You know, I don't know if many people even know many ministers in Nigeria, you know, but what's your own view, very quickly?
Well, my view is very simple. Nigeria is a frontline country in the sense that we have some of the best brains you can talk about, not just on the African continent, but globally, in any area of influence. Talk about the US, the best brains in science, in medicine, in engineering, whether they're in the military forces or in the civilian area, Nigerians are top notch. In fact, I listened to a newscast where they said, of all the foreign
immigrants
in US, Nigeria was number one.
Yeah.
Even the rate of education among Nigerians in the US, way beyond what the average American percentage is. So we have the best brains. We should not in any way settle for anything but the best in those who will serve this nation. We should seek them out.
So where is the lacuna coming from? Because if you say we have the best
We
people,
have the best.
and at the end of the day, we seem not to get, we have square pegs in round holes, or we do not have people that are competent, you know?
In fact, that's where the problem lies. The people who should get a review of their position, there are many, and they cut across. Because who puts them there? Are they the best available? What are the basis and the consideration on which you have brought in these people? Can't you get better replacements?
Okay.
And when you look beyond see, the problem with us in this country is that there are, when we want to fill a particular position, we ask around, where does it come from? What language does it speak? What church or what religion does it belong to?
Political inclination.
These are things that influence our decisions.
Okay.
And in the end, you don't get the best. And tomorrow you quarrel with them. The people never claim to have the expertise you have ascribed to them. And because you put them there, they have not performed. Nobody expected them really to do carry out any magic. So
let's bring in Mr. Chukwu here, even as we end the program. Mr. Chukwu, how many ministers in this administration can you name off the cuff for me? Let's do a test. Because many Nigerians, many Nigerians may not know many of their ministers. I can also be put to the test. Can I mention 10 of our ministers off the cuff?
I can do that.
You know, many Nigerians can do that. Perhaps Eli Mohammed, I know Chechukwu Oga, I know Festus Keyamo, Geoffrey Onyama, I know Olamilekon Adegbite. How many have I mentioned now? 6. Have I mentioned Lai Mohammed, the popular information minister, you know? Minister of Finance, definitely. Zainab Ahmed, Minister of Labour, Chris Ngige, Festus Keyamo, Goswill Akpabio, Timi Silva. How many have I mentioned? I think I've mentioned 10 or so. But why I'm saying so, Minister Fashola. Yes. Why I'm saying so is because how many ministers can Nigerians, do they even know their ministers? Some people may just be hearing Sabo Nanano for the first time yesterday, let alone Salem Man of Power. What do you think? Quickly.
You know, that's why I say that if they do regular appraisals and they check the performance of each of the ministers, by now the president would have done 10 cabinet reshuffles since he came into power. clearly there are several of people who are sitting in positions of executive authority on behalf of the president that we can't feel their impact. Nigerians don't even know they exist. Talk less about the fact that they is exercising executive authority. Also, clearly, if we can't mention them and we can't remember them, then they're not in existence as far as we are concerned, because we can't feel the impact of several of these ministers. I hope that the president will use the remaining 2 years to rejig effectively, to bring in effectively into his ministry. 2 years still enough to leave some indelible
I was coming to that. Is two years enough?
Time.
Mr.
But
Mr.
if we
Chukwu,
continue with the colorless people we have there, we may end up with a colorless history.
Mr. Chukwu, I was coming to that. If 2 years is indeed enough, especially looking at Nigeria's political history, because I know from next year we'll begin to see some horse trading around around 2023. So is 2 years definitely enough? Mr. President has had, I think, over 6 years now or so to rejig his cabinet and you know, do the magic, as Prof did say earlier on. There are a lot more ministers that people don't know. Perhaps those that I've mentioned are those that are like in the news sometimes. There are a lot more. The Alasho Aduras, the there are many that people don't know their names or even what they do. Yes. You know, so very quickly as we close, in 30 seconds, while I come to Prof.
Well, 2 years is not enough, but there's a saying that it's better late than never. If we start now, we could have some mileage. It may not be enough to leave the government in sterling performance, but we could have some. They could actually lay the ground rules for the next government to take off from.
Okay, Prof, your closing remarks.
Well,
in respect of everything which we've talked about. We're talking GDP. The President sacked Minister of Agriculture and Power yesterday. Two critical components that will move, you know, the economy forward.
Thank you very much. Let me just interpret the events of the past few weeks as a signal that the president wants to do something remarkable to leave a legacy after his tenure is over. I will encourage him to press on and complete this thing the way it ought to be done. Let him not rest on his oars. This nation must be turned around for good. We have all it takes to be a great nation, and anyone who does not share that vision has no business ruling this nation. We ought to put our acts together, mobilize our resources, get the best brains available, and leave a legacy that children's children will talk about after we've done our work and gone.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Professor Chuka Osisioma, the President of ANAN Chairman Governing Council, as well as Johnson Chukwu, who is the Group Managing Director at Cowry Asset Management. That's the show today, but we'll continue to interrogate this cabinet's reshuffle. Perhaps we'll do a little bit of it tomorrow. I'll just tune in tomorrow because so much to still talk about, just opposing it around the KPIs of the minister. I am Nancy Naji. Be the best you can be, be the change you want to see. I'll see you all again tomorrow, God willing. Bye now.